In June of 1994, 44,000 car owners drove to rural Tennessee town of fewer than 1,000 people to shake hands with the assembly line workers who had built their sedans. The mechanism that made them do it was something the American auto industry had not produced in 50 years. A car company that customers genuinely loved. Then General Motors, the parent company that had created it, spent the next 15 years quietly taking it apart. The executives who designed those decisions are still cited in business school case studies. They retire with their pensions intact. They are counting on this story being old enough that nobody remembers. What follows is the autopsy, not of why Saturn died, but of why a corporation would rather strangle the only beloved brand it ever produced than let that brand embarrass the rest of the company. The body is still warm in your neighbor's driveway. Saturn began as Detroit's confession. In 1980, General Motors held 46% of the American car market. By 1985, it was bleeding share faster than any company in industrial history, and the Japanese imports were eating the lunch the Big Three had served themselves for 50 years. Honda Accords and Toyota Corollas were parked in suburban driveways that used to belong to Chevrolet Malibus and Oldsmobile Cutlasses. The young families who would normally walk into a Chevy showroom in 1979 and drive out in whatever was on the lot were, by 1985, driving home from Honda dealers instead. GM's small cars were the proof. The Chevrolet Chevette was a penalty box that rusted at the sight of road salt. The Pontiac T1000 was the same car with a different grille and a worse name. And when GM tried to compete on the higher end, it produced the Cadillac Cimarron, a Chevrolet Cavalier with leather seats and a $5,000 markup. The Cimarron remains, 4 decades later, one of the most ridiculed cars in American automotive history. It deserves the ridicule. GM had been caught making the same car twice and charging more the second time. Roger B. Smith, a short bespectacled accountant who ran the world's largest car maker, made one decision in his career that history might forgive him for. He decided GM could not fix its small car problem from inside its existing structure. The unions were too entrenched. The job classifications, more than 90 of them at most GM plants, were too rigid. The dealer networks were too hostile to the customer. So, on January 7, 1985, GM incorporated a new subsidiary called the Saturn Corporation, committed up to $5 billion to it, and announced that Saturn would build a new car in a new factory with a new workforce under a new union contract. No inherited platforms, no leftover parts bins, no Detroit. The contract Saturn signed with United Auto Workers official Donald Eflin ran 28 pages. The standard GM agreement at the time contained nearly 200 job classifications. At Saturn, workers were salaried, the assembly line could be stopped by any team member who saw a defect, and labor and management actually sat in the same meetings. It was, on paper, the most radical industrial experiment in American manufacturing since the original Ford assembly line. And for a brief, strange window in the 1990s, it worked. The first Saturn rolled off the line in Spring Hill, Tennessee on July 31st, 1990. It was a small sedan called the SL, and by any measurement of speed, styling, or technology, it was unremarkable. What stood out were 2 specific details. The body panels were not steel. They were a polymer composite engineered to flex on impact and never rust. You could press your thumb into the fender and the dimple would pop back out. In a country where parking lot dings drove people into low-grade therapy, that fender was a small revelation. The second detail was how Saturn sold the car. The price on the sticker was the price you paid. The sales staff was salaried, not commissioned. Nobody pressured you into the rust protection package you did not need. The waiting room had coffee, the restrooms were clean, and the people behind the desk would actually tell you if you were buying more car than your family needed. In 1991, Saturn discovered a defective coolant mixture in the first 1,836 cars off the line. Instead of mailing a standard recall letter, dealers picked up the phone, called each owner personally, apologized, and in many cases drove to the owner's house to retrieve the car themselves. By 1994, Saturn was selling 286,000 cars a year. J.D. Power Satisfaction surveys ranked Saturn alongside Lexus and Infiniti, which was absurd for a sedan that cost less than $15,000. School teachers and nurses and retirees were driving their Saturns to Tennessee for the annual Homecoming Festival, and 44,000 of them showed up that June eating barbecue on the factory lawn while their children climbed into half-assembled SLs on the assembly floor. Saturn had accidentally built what every other car company spends $100 million a year trying to manufacture through advertising: brand love. And GM, watching from its Detroit headquarters, did not know what to do with it. But Saturn's success carried a problem no spreadsheet could ignore. Each of those 286,000 cars sold in 1994 had thin margins. The $5 billion GM had poured into Spring Hill, into the polymer panel tooling, into the new engine plant, was nowhere near recouped. The accountants in the Renaissance Center looked at their balance sheet and saw a subsidiary buying customer loyalty at a price they could not afford to keep paying. So GM made the decision that, in retrospect, was the moment Saturn died. They decided not to build a second-generation Saturn. The original Saturn S-Series had been engineered from a blank sheet of paper: unique chassis, unique 1.9-liter four-cylinder engine, unique polymer body. Replacing it from scratch would have cost another $1 billion or more, and GM was not willing to spend that money on a brand that was still operating in the red. So, Saturn engineers were told to wait. The S-Series launched in 1990 and was not properly replaced until 2003. 13 years. In that 13-year window, Honda redesigned the Civic twice. Toyota refreshed the Corolla 3 times. Hyundai and Kia entered the American market and built better small cars than Saturn was still selling. You could walk into a Saturn dealership in 2001 and see essentially the same car you had bought in 1992, maybe with different headlights. The competition had moved on. Saturn was standing still in Spring Hill, and the line workers who built the original SL knew exactly what was being done to them. The sales decline showed up in the data within 5 years and never reversed. The first mistake was the decision not to spend. Every mistake after it was a consequence of that one. The replacement, when it finally arrived in 2003, was called the Ion. It was not a Saturn, it was a Chevrolet Cobalt with a different badge and a center-mounted instrument cluster nobody had asked for. The Delta platform underneath the Ion was shared with the Cobalt, the Pontiac G5, the Chevy HHR, and the Opel Astra. The unique engineering was gone. The polymer body panels were partially gone too. By the time the second-generation Saturn Vue arrived in 2008, manufactured in Ramos Arizpe, Mexico, on the same platform as the Opel Antara, the panels were gone entirely. Sheet steel, like every other GM crossover. Then came the Saturn Aura in 2006, an Epsilon platform sedan that shared its bones with the Opel Vectra, the Chevy Malibu, and the Saab 9-3. Then the Saturn Astra in 2008, which was a literal Opel Astra built in Antwerp, Belgium, shipped across the Atlantic and stamped with a Saturn logo on the grille. The Saturn Outlook crossover was identical to the GMC Acadia and the Buick Enclave, with a different grille and a different badge. Walk into a Saturn dealership in 2007 and not one car on the floor had been designed by a Saturn engineer. The people in Spring Hill who had spent 20 years developing their own powertrains, their own chassis, and their own production methods were now assembling badge-engineered Opels and Chevies for a customer base that increasingly could not tell why they were paying more. The second mistake was the decision to make Saturn just another GM brand. By the time GM was finished, Saturn was selling the same cars its customers could have bought down the street at the Chevy lot, often for less. If this autopsy is the kind of story you wanted to hear told straight, the subscribe button does the rest. But the most quietly damning decision was the third one, because it was the one that never made the press. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, Saturn engineers in Spring Hill repeatedly asked GM headquarters for the development money to build a unique sport utility vehicle. The American market was moving aggressively into crossovers. Saturn dealers, the most loyal sales network in the American auto industry, were begging for product. And the answer that came back from Detroit, according to former Saturn executives quoted in Newsweek's March 2010 postmortem, was that Saturn customers should be buying Chevy SUVs instead. You read that correctly. The internal GM position was that Saturn should not be allowed to compete for the customers it had built because those customers, in theory, belonged to Chevrolet. Of the 41% of Saturn buyers who had previously owned a GM car, the cannibalization argument went, Saturn was just shuffling them around the corporate parking lot. But this is where the GM defense falls apart. 75% of Saturn's sales according to GM's own internal data, came from buyers who would otherwise have bought a Honda or a Toyota. Saturn was not stealing from Chevy. Saturn was the only GM brand actually winning back the Japanese imports. GM did not see it that way. They built the Saturn Vue in 2002 as a half effort on a platform shared with the Chevrolet Equinox. They built the Outlook as a triple badge job. They never gave Saturn a single vehicle the brand could call its own. The most loyal customer base in the American auto industry was, year after year, told to buy something else. The third mistake was the decision to treat Saturn's customers as poached property instead of as the only people GM had actually earned the loyalty of. They were wrong. The people who studied Saturn in real time were not subtle about what was happening. Saul Rubenstein, a professor at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, who co-authored an academic study on Saturn, told Newsweek in 2010 that the dismantling was a real tragedy. Newsweek's own March 2010 postmortem ran under the headline, "How GM Crushed Saturn." Not how Saturn failed, how GM crushed it. David Cole, the head of the Center for Automotive Research, had predicted in 1990 that Saturn would scare the liver out of the Japanese. He was right for about 4 years. James Harbour, the most quoted automotive consultant of the era, predicted that GM was about to kick the imports from one end of the country to the other. He was right for about 4 years. Then the cancer came back from inside the host. You can read the entire trajectory in the trade press of the time, and the verdict is consistent. Every outside expert who studied Saturn at its peak agreed it was the future of American manufacturing. GM agreed too, in public. In private, GM could not bring itself to fund the future it had built. By 2008, General Motors itself was dying. The financial crisis crushed auto sales across the board, but GM had been bleeding money for 2 decades. At its peak, the company had operated 8 separate car brands in the United States, many of them selling near-identical vehicles to the same customers through competing dealerships on the same street. The overhead was staggering. On June 1st, 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It remains the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. The federal government injected roughly $50 billion to keep the company alive. As part of the restructuring, GM announced it would eliminate 4 of its brands: Pontiac, Hummer, Saab, and Saturn. For Saturn, there was one last chance. Roger Penske, the racing magnate and one of the most respected operators in the dealer industry, offered to buy the brand on June 5th, 2009. The plan was that GM would continue building the Aura, the Vue, and the Outlook on a contract basis for 2 years, while Penske lined up a long-term supplier through the Renault-Nissan alliance. For 3 months, the Saturn dealer network, 350 stores nationwide, believed it might survive. On September 30th, 2009, the Renault-Nissan board, with objections from the Nissan side, rejected the supply contract. Penske walked the same day. A week later, on October 7th, 2009, the last Saturn rolled off the assembly line in Ramos Arizpe, Mexico. By October 31st, 2010, every Saturn dealership in America had closed its doors. The cumulative loss, according to independent analysts who reviewed GM's filings after the bankruptcy, came to as much as $12 billion over the brand's 25-year life. General Motors spent $12 billion to prove it could build a car company Americans loved, then spent 15 years convincing itself it could not afford to keep it. Today, the Spring Hill factory still operates. The same building Saturn workers poured the concrete for in the late 1980s now builds the Cadillac XT5, the XT6, the all-electric Cadillac Lyrique, and the 3-row Vistic. Nearly 4,000 people still work inside it. The roads that were paved for Saturn workers in the late 1980s still carry traffic. The town of Spring Hill, which had a population of barely 1,000 when General Motors arrived, has grown into a community of more than 50,000. The 5-mile Saturn Parkway connecting the plant to Interstate 65 still bears the name, even though no Saturn has been built there in over 15 years. What is missing is the brand. What is missing is the homecoming. What is missing is the most loyal customer base ever assembled around an American car company. You can still find the old Saturns in driveways across the country with 200,000 miles on the odometer, held together by polymer panels that never rusted. Owners post on forums and trade parts. They remember the day they drove to Spring Hill. Some of them are still angry. Most of them just feel cheated. The polymer panels outlasted the brand. That is the closest thing the story has to justice. What Saturn proves is not that corporations are evil, though sometimes they are. The lesson is harder and older, and it applies far beyond Detroit. The hardest thing any large organization can do is allow something better to exist inside it without slowly, methodically remaking that thing in the image of the mediocrity that surrounds it. Saturn was different. That was always the point. In the end, that was always the problem. General Motors had the most loyal customers in the American auto industry. They had the manufacturing template every American competitor was studying. They had a workforce that had volunteered to leave secure jobs at other plants for a chance to build something better. And they killed it because the rest of the company looked worse by comparison. If that pattern sounds familiar, you have probably worked for a company that did the same thing. If you owned a Saturn, tell us in the comments. We want to know which year, which model, and whether it is still in your driveway.